To say the Isle of Siptah DLC was a success would be a lie. Conan's first and only map expansion had all the promise in the world, yet as we've discussed a few times on this channel, it was a failure. What we haven't discussed is why, and today we'll look back through the history of the expansion to find out. To start off, we should first establish a timeline of where the crucial events lie. Siptah was first teased on social media, then a countdown began from September 3rd to September 9th, 2020. The announcement came on September 10th, early access release was September 15th, producer letter on December 18th, update 2.3 on March 16th, 2021, update 2.4 on April 22nd, 2021, and full release on all platforms on May 27th, 2021. Excitement was high in the run-up to the release of Siptah, and people were looking forward to a brand new experience as Conan had never seen a different map yet. The Isle of Siptah dropped into early access with 14 dungeons, 2 building sets, new armours, a rhino mount, a new map to explore with a new gameplay loop and plenty more, so how did it end up going wrong? Well, let's start with that early access release. Early access was only available on PC and came on September 15th, 2020 with a $20 price tag. The devs were pretty upfront with the DLC not yet being complete and sought to get player feedback as they developed the map further. Nonetheless, the map was still playable, just not fully finished. At the time, opinions varied. Some players loved what was there and others really didn't like it. Siptah back then was much different than it is now, which is something the player base were pretty split on. According to the December producer letter, the gameplay loop was designed for you to tackle the vaults to gain sigil buffs and Eldarium metal, use the sigils to help you hunt the storm monsters and harvest their essence, then use the Eldarium and essence to summon surges for a chance to capture thralls. In practice that loop did work, but people weren't too sure about it, and outside of that loop, things felt a bit rough. According to this data from the December producer letter, the top complaints of negative reviews focus mostly on the map, thralls, and bugs/miscellaneous. A lot of the map complaints centred around variety and activities to do, a lot of thrall complaints focused on the grind of getting thralls and the dissatisfaction with thrall acquisition mechanics and the lack of NPC camps, and the miscellaneous section was dominated by complaints of bugs themselves, along with a focus on PvP being a lesser though still present complaint. Not exactly off to the best start, but not unrecoverable by any means. The producer letter in December promised many new features and adjustments, and they would indeed arrive with the next 2 major updates. Update 2.3 brought lots of new NPC camps to Siptah, allowing thralls to be captured in the traditional way, addressing a major complaint in early access. The gameplay loop we talked about earlier was broken to remove the features' dependence upon each other, rebalancing vaults to level 60 with unique rewards, making the storm less pervasive and allowing you to build inside of it, and changing the rewards for surges, though they largely remained the same. They also added new purges and a treasure chamber in the tower, with a promise of even more to come in the next update. Update 2.4 came around and fulfilled that promise in a pretty big way. Siptah grew larger with the addition of 3 new islands in the south, bringing the total map size up to around 90% of the exiled lands. This expansion also brought new enemies, creatures, camps, ruined cities, and the pool's PvE mechanic, the latter of which allowed you to essentially summon a boss fight on demand. They also made improvements to the visuals on the island, making things more colourful and brighter, which had been a significant aesthetic complaint of many. Finally, they added the new Zath religion and the respective avatar. All of these updates and listening to feedback sounds great, but I'd be remiss to not mention one of the worst parts of this whole saga. The Siptah Drought was one of the roughest periods in Conan's life cycle. Though it looks like Funcom were snappy with getting updates and news out just based on the timeline of this video, the reality was not like that. It was a period of prolonged silence and zero movement between updates. Updates 2.3 and 2.4 only added minor things for players on all platforms, and though these were different times for Conan, they did next to nothing to add new content for players to enjoy outside of Siptah. If you didn't buy Siptah on PC, or if you were on console and just couldn't buy it anyway, it was a pretty miserable time. From early access to full release, it was 8 months of near silence and basically nothing new if you weren't on Siptah, and even if you were, updates and news came far too slow to keep up the excitement. The biggest benefit of early access projects is the speed they can work at. Early access titles generally come with the expectation of speedy communication and updates, but that just wasn't the case for Siptah, and it really hurt the perception of the DLC and the game overall. Even the content creation space for Siptah was pretty miserable in my experience. I was still just a building channel back then, and I built loads of things on Siptah, but if you're a console player that can't even get onto Siptah for the foreseeable future, why would you bother to watch? The drought was really harmful to the game, and I think played a big part in why Siptah failed. Eventually though, the drought did break, and the Isle of Siptah released on the 27th of May 2021. The map hit full release in a vastly different state than it was on early access launch, and to be fair, I think the changes made were for the best. It also brought Conan Exiles onto Game Pass, alongside bringing Twitch drops to Conan and allowing for the loading of modded maps, which wasn't possible before. Well, seems all good, right? All platforms finally have access to Siptah, the experience has been vastly improved since early access, so what went wrong afterwards? After the release of Siptah, Update 2.5 in August 2021 introduced character transfers, which did incentivise playing on Siptah, but transfers were disabled some years ago for unknown reasons and have never returned. Because of this, Siptah basically stood alone as a separate experience until the Age of Sorcery, when updates were made more frequent and plentiful. Siptah also received these updates in some cases, but other stuff like Kurak's Dungeon, the Metcamosis storyline, the Siege of Almeria didn't get onto Siptah. This created a feeling for the people that did enjoy playing on Siptah where it felt like they were missing out on a lot of the content of the new updates. This is straying into the territory where Siptah was already considered a failure, but it can't be left out as it will be integral to why it failed. So let's try and answer the question, why did the Isle of Siptah fail? I think it's a multifaceted issue, but there are definitely a few points we can look at to identify where Siptah went wrong. First, Siptah's early access launch was underwhelming with plenty of issues and criticism. Whilst this might be expected for a new game, especially in early access, as a DLC for an established title, it diminished excitement and impact. Launching as a complete product across all platforms with adjustments in post-release updates would have been much better. Secondly, the Siptah Drought hit everyone, but especially console players, who also happen to be the majority of customers. They endured 8 months of close to nothing after the DLC announcement, and the marketing campaign didn't build much suspense. By release, because of YouTube videos and the like, they'd likely already seen all the content on Siptah and felt like they were just getting leftovers from PC. The long wait drained the console launch of much of its impact. Thirdly, uniqueness. New maps should feel different, but Siptah focused on an unbalanced gameplay loop at first. Thralls are pretty essential throughout the entirety of your gameplay of Conan Exiles, but they were locked behind late game progression, which caused a lot of frustration. While later changes did alleviate this, Siptah then ultimately ended up playing only a little differently from the Exile lands. If you're looking at it critically, you're going to get mostly the same experience, just with a different coat of paint. The devs aimed for uniqueness but missed the mark, and then by removing the gameplay loop that a lot of people were dissatisfied with, they didn't add a new, unique way to progress through the map that would have enticed people to play it. Fourth, pricing. The price was likely the biggest obstacle to Siptah's success. At $20 it deterred many players, especially console users who, again, had already seen most of the content before release. While Conan likely needed the income at the time, Siptah might have performed better as a free update, with cosmetics and building sets sold separately as a companion DLC. Finally, the culmination of a lot of these factors, splitting the player base. Conan's player count isn't huge, and without crossplay, finding populated servers can already be tricky. A paid map expansion further divided players, leaving those on Siptah with even fewer fellow server members, something that might have just pushed them back to the Exile lands. This cycle, favouring the original map, could have been at least partly avoided by releasing Siptah for free. Ultimately, Siptah's failure stemmed from multiple factors: design missteps, a lacklustre launch, pricing, and splitting the player base. While the map can be enjoyable for certain players, and some may even prefer it to the Exile lands, the reason for its general failure are clear. The player splitting effect especially has been cited by developers as a reason why all content updates, minor or major, will be free for everyone following the Age of Sorcery. In 2025, Siptah's ended up in a bit of a weird place. The map is playable, and I've heard many enjoy it, but because of its general failure, it's fallen into the role of the sometimes forgotten stepchild. It still gets updates, but some features like dungeons, companions, and whole quest lines are absent on Siptah, instead being purely crafted for the Exile lands experience, as that's what the majority of people prefer to play. Whether that preference was always inherent, or is a result of the missteps made with Siptah in the first place, that's kind of up for debate. Siptah's failure has left a bit of a legacy on the game. As of January 2025, it was the first and last official map made for Conan, and given its failure, I would imagine there is a degree of trepidation about making another one from the development team. People still ask for a new map, of course, but people also ask for maps prior to Siptah. Can the devs be certain that their effort put into a new map wouldn't result in the same failure? I'd like to think they could learn from what went wrong with Siptah. A new map would certainly draw a lot of interest from the player base, both current and lapsed. Especially if it's released for free. I think that's probably the biggest bonus they can give to help it succeed, but also I think expectations would need to be set and managed. Siptah's in a weird state where some people want it to get all the features of every update, but to be frank, some of them don't fit. Kurak's Dungeon, the Siege of Al Moriah, even the Purge which Siptah did get, they basically ruin the lore of Siptah. If another map is made in the future, I think Funcom would be wise to lay out the terms of exactly what that entails. If it's a handcrafted standalone experience, they should lay out what it is in the beginning. Ultimately, the Isle of Siptah failed in what an additional map expansion should be. It failed to draw and keep players, to offer something you can't get on any other map. It does have unique vistas, interesting locations, and some semblance of an alternative experience, but Siptah ultimately ends up feeling much of the same as the Exiled Lands in practice. The devs tried to do something different at first, but it failed to land, and a combination of factors prevented it from being a successful alternative map, in that it was unable to offer something new to players that they couldn't get on the Exiled Lands, and it also failed to bring them and keep them on that map. That being said, Siptah can still be enjoyable. I've heard others say it's better for experienced Conan players, which I'd agree with, but I also think it offers an interesting visual and thematic experience. The map is fun to explore, it has many intriguing spots and plenty of fun to be had, so whilst it may have failed to become a viable alternative, it's not without merit, and it's worth a try, especially for builders. Unfortunately, I don't think there's much room for Siptah to recover right now, at least not in the current game. If Conan gets a sequel or a next-gen remaster, as we talked about in a previous video, things can be done, but for now that ship has sailed a long time ago. I can imagine Funcom feel a bit burnt on the idea of new maps given the Siptah situation, but I don't think we'd see a repeat if a new map came nowadays, if only because it'd be released for free. I think the pricing was probably the biggest initial impediment to Siptah's success. Nonetheless, Siptah can be a fun experience, but it was undoubtedly a general failure. Today we looked back at its development and the reasons why it failed, and hopefully this video has proved informative for those of you who want to know why Siptah didn't live up to its potential. Thank you for watching, and of course a massive thanks to our wonderful esteemed coffee cultists for continuing to support the channel over on Patreon. If you want to see videos early and support the channel directly, consider joining us over on Patreon, link in the description and pinned comment. Take care, and I'll see you soon.